Trapezius. Great muscle, great big muscle. We're going to look at the anatomy of the trapezius muscle on its own because not only is it a big one, but it does some important jobs. So we will need to look at where the muscle is, look at the bones that it attaches to, talk about the movements of those bones, talk about how trapezius moves those bones, and then that'll let us work out why it's so important and what its major functions are. We'll talk about its innervation, we'll maybe chuck in some blood supply, and yeah, that sort of thing, you know, anatomy stuff. Trapezius. All right, trapezius. Here it is. So on this model, we can see trapezius on the right side. On the left side, it's been taken away, so we can see the deeper structures. But it forms this, well, if you put the two muscles together, it forms this trapezium shape. There are 4 sides and it's irregular. Trapezium, the traps. If you have an oral anatomy exam, a viva voce, there is one question you can get right just by saying, ooh. And that question is, what is a function of the trapezius muscle? Ooh. He shrugs your shoulders. You probably all knew that gag, didn't you? But the trapezius muscle has fibers running in different directions, and it attaches to some bones. We'll have a look at that in a moment. But it means, can you see how these fibers are running in those different directions? Which means that this muscle can pull bones in different directions, which means it has different functions, which means it is a little complicated, but very important. Right, trapezius. So the bones involved. The trapezius muscle is a superficial muscle of the back and the shoulder and the neck and the upper limb. Here we have the vertebral column. We have cervical vertebrae in the neck. The posterior bone of the skull is the occipital bone, and this lump here, which you can palpate on yourself, is the external occipital protuberance. We have thoracic vertebrae. This is the scapula, and then this sticky-80 bit here is the spine of the scapula. And if I turn this around, this is the clavicle and the humerus. The long bone of the upper limb, the humerus, is articulating with the scapula. So it's the scapula that actually has the socket of the ball and socket of the glenohumeral joint, or the joint of the shoulder, about which we move the upper limb. So those are the bones we need to know about. What are the movements that we need to know about? Okay, so this is the shoulder girdle. So we've got the scapula and the clavicle, and notice how the scapula is not actually articulating with any of these bones around here. The scapula is free floating over the rib cage and is held in place by muscles such as the trapezius muscle. It is attached, it does articulate with the clavicle, and the clavicle is attached to the manubriosternum, so to the axial skeleton here. But other than that, this bone is floating around. So the shoulder girdle can be elevated, which is shrugging your shoulders. You elevate your shoulder girdle. The opposite of that then is depression of the shoulder girdle. You bring your shoulders back down again. And the scapula can move around, so it can slide around the rib cage. I've got another skeleton. This one is strung with elastic. So the scapula can slide around the rib cage. As I said, it's floating upon the rib cage. Imagine muscles here holding it in place. So then these muscles can change length. So we can move the scapula around the rib cage. So you can protract the scapula, that is, pull it around anteriorly, and then you can retract the scapula. That's pinching your shoulder blades together, right? Retraction of the scapula. And then the scapula can also rotate, and it can rotate that away and it can rotate that away. Now remember that the socket, the glenoid fossa of the ball and socket joint of the shoulder joint here is part of the scapula. So if we rotate the scapula, we change where that socket joint is pointing. So then movement of the scapula is important to the freedom of movement and the range of movement of the upper limb. For example, the bony point you can feel here is the acromion, the highest point of the scapula. You can feel where the clavicle joins the acromion, where it joins the scapula. You can feel your shoulder girdle. So when you elevate and depress your shoulder girdle, you can feel it going up and down. Now, if you keep your hand here and you don't rotate your scapula and then you abduct the upper limb, that's as high as you can get, to about 90 degrees. To get any higher, you need to rotate the scapula, and this might be called upwards rotation. You'll read different terms describing this, which is awkward, but upwards rotation is quite nice, or medial rotation. So then if you let your scapula, so okay, here we go, abducting the upper limb, and then we're going to let the scapula rotate, and now I can raise my arm above my head, scratch the top of my head. If I cannot upwardly rotate my scapula, I can't do this. I can only get my arm this high. Okay? We saw that the trapezius goes up the neck. So let's consider movements of the neck. We also have flexion of the neck and the head, and extension. And we have lateral flexion of the head and neck to either side. So we've got the bones, we've got the movements. Let's look at the muscle, right? Going around here somewhere. Okay, here we go. So here is the trapezius muscle. So its origins are in the midline and its insertions are away from the midline. So the origins of the trapezius muscle are that external occipital protuberance. And here in the midline, because the cervical vertebrae make a little bit of a curve, there's like a flat ligament in there which the muscle's attached to, called the nuchal ligament. So the origin of trapezius up here is from the external occipital protuberance, the nuchal ligament, and essentially the spinous processes of the cervical vertebrae, but that's really only becoming true when you get down here to C7. So if you feel the back of your neck, the first, like at my collar line, the first really lumpy spinous process that I feel, that is the C7 vertebra. And then the origin continues as the thoracic vertebrae's spinous processes and supraspinous ligament. So this is where the muscle comes from. And then the fibers run out laterally to the lateral third of the clavicle and to the acromion and to this part of the scapula. Here is the spine of the scapula, so it inserts into the spine of the scapula. I know it's a bit awkward, isn't it? We say spine of the scapula, and then we're also thinking spine. Now, I said that we have fibers running in different directions. So trapezius gets described as having a superior part, a middle part, and an inferior part. Upper fibers, transverse fibers, and lower fibers, something like that. And I don't know if you get a sense now of how those fibers might move those bones. If we consider the neck, then if the left and right trapezius muscles both work at the same time, they will extend the head and neck. So they'll go from that to that position, which means that trapezius is, there are lots of muscles in the neck here, but it is a muscle of posture. If you're, you know, the way you're sat or the way you're stood or the way, if you're lifting your head up riding the bicycle, trapezius is involved in that. But look at how these fibers run down here to the clavicle and the scapula. What's that all about? Well, that's part of the elevation of the shoulder girdle, but there's more there. Do you get a sense of the fibers kind of being like suspensory cables hanging the shoulder girdle from the axial skeleton? The axial skeleton being, you know, the vertebral column and the rib cage, right? And the head. The upper limb is a heavy thing. If you're an anatomist, you know this because you've lifted up upper limbs on their own, but probably not very many other people have. Anyway, the upper limb is a heavy thing. But imagine if you're carrying like a heavy bag of shopping, or if you're doing a deadlift in the gym and you're lifting something heavy, the load from the upper limb, so the humerus is trying to be pulled out of the glenohumeral joint, out of that ball and socket joint, and the deltoid muscle here is running from the spine of the scapula and that lateral third of the clavicle to the humerus and holding the bone into the joint. So the weight's being transferred through this large muscle, and then that load is being transferred to the axial skeleton by trapezius, because trapezius is holding the shoulder girdle up, holding everything in. So when you're carrying that heavy bag of shopping, this muscle is working to hold this together, this muscle is working to hold this together. So these muscles are suspending that load that are in your that's in your hand through your shoulder to your axial skeleton. Pretty neat, huh? So the upper fibers of trapezius are important to transferring loads to the upper limb. And they also elevate the shoulder girdle. And these upper fibers, if both sides work together, then they will extend the neck. If one side works alone, it will laterally flex the neck. That trapezius will do that. This trapezius will do that. Dun, 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 dun. And possibly a little bit of rotation. Now, if you're in the gym and you're deadlifting, you're lifting a very heavy weight, right? What do you think will happen if you're lifting that heavy weight and you turn your neck? What do you think will happen to the trapezius fibers? Well, one side's going to have to lengthen and one side's going to have to shorten. Skeletal muscle is most commonly torn during eccentric contraction. That is, the muscle is contracting and getting longer. So if you're lifting a heavy load, the upper fibers of trapezius are under load. They're contracting to hold that load, to hold that upper limb into the axial skeleton. And then if you turn your neck, one side, those muscle fibers have got to lengthen and the other side have got to shorten. So there's a risk of damaging trapezius with that movement. There are multiple schools of thought about actually whether you look ahead, look up, look down, but generally it's agreed that you keep looking in the same direction. The argument is whether you keep it in line with your spine and what have you, but that's something else. So the upper fibers of trapezius, interesting, huh? The middle fibers of trapezius are running transversely, they're running horizontally from the vertebrae to the scapula. So if these muscles contract, they're going to bring the scapula medially. They're going to retract the scapula. That's the pinching your shoulder blades together. If you take trapezius off, you see the rhomboids. The rhomboids also do this job. The lower fibers, the inferior fibers, well, can you see how they're running at quite a sharp angle in this direction, quite the opposite to the upper fibers. So these lower fibers, if the shoulder girdle is elevated, they will pull the shoulder girdle back down again, so they will depress the shoulder girdle. So these fibers, in one sense, will work in opposition, letting the scapula and the shoulder girdle move up and down. If you do, dips in the gym, like you dip down and push yourself up again, dips will strengthen the lower fibers the lower part of trapezius. So that's what the lower part is doing. It's pulling the scapula down, right? So you're going from that to that against gravity. Does that make sense? So if you're sat in a chair and you push down to get out of the chair, you're using this part of trapezius because upper limb movement, pulling that down, pulling the... You get it. But there is that other movement, isn't there? The rotation of the scapula. So if we want to rotate the scapula like that, so rotate the scapula like that, the upper fibers will pull on the spine of the scapula, right? So that they pull the scapula that way. And, whoops, the lower fibers, the way they come in here, will also help with that movement. So the upper fibers and lower fibers of trapezius work together to rotate the scapula so that you can raise your arm above your head. This muscle here, serratus anterior, big lateral muscle, also attaches to the scapula. That's going to help with that. And the rhomboid muscles and levator scapulae will help rotate in the other direction, downward rotation. So upward rotation, trapezius, downward rotation, these guys. So trapezius is important in rotating the scapula. Am I over-egging that point? But it's important. So if you're in the gym, it's the overhead press exercise. And you can feel your own muscle, or you can feel somebody else's muscle. You can feel the spine of the scapula moving if you want to test out all of this. But the overhead press exercise is rotating the scapula, is training trapezius to do that move, is keeping your trapezius healthy. The innervation to the trapezius muscle is also special. It's innervated by the accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, or at least the motor bit of it is. So this is a muscle of the shoulder of the upper limb that is not innervated by a branch of the brachial plexus. It's innervated by a cranial nerve that drops down here, which means that you can test the cranial accessory nerve by asking somebody to shrug the shoulders against resistance and compare both sides. This means that if the accessory nerve is injured, severed, so this nerve becomes paralysed, you won't be able to put your hand on top of your head on that side of the body. You won't be able to scratch your head, comb your hair, that sort of thing, because you won't be able to rotate the scapula. It means that because the scapula is held in place against the thoracic cage by muscles like the trapezius, if the trapezius is paralysed, it means that with some positions of the upper limb, with some movements, the scapula will wing away. It'll be pulled away from the thoracic wall by other muscles because they won't be opposed by trapezius holding it in as it should be held in. There will be a loss in the shape of the top of the shoulder on this side compared to the other side, and this shoulder girdle is likely to hang down a little bit more than the other side if the accessory nerve is injured on this side and paralysed, and this muscle is paralysed. It's likely to cause neck pain and shoulder pain and so on. The accessory nerve is actually found running through here. This gets called the posterior triangle of the neck. So it runs through here, so it's actually quite superficial. It's somewhat prone to injury during surgery in this area. It's just one of those things that surgeons try to avoid, but it's not always possible. So the accessory nerve. Oh, I said that was the motor bit. Okay, this is probably getting out. We're getting out into the weeds a little bit now, but muscles send sensory information back to the central nervous system as well, right? Like the length of the muscle, the position of the muscle in space, proprioception, the stretch of the muscle, pain and that sort of thing. Sensory information from trapezius is actually sent back through spinal nerves C3 and C4, which is a little weird but kind of cool, right? So the sensory stuff goes back through spinal nerves into the neck. Blood supply to trapezius, well, I mean up here we have the occipital artery, but blood supply to the trapezius is generally described as through the transverse cervical artery. So an artery around here in the neck. The transverse cervical artery gives off superficial cervical artery, dorsal scapular artery. The transverse cervical artery is itself a branch of the thyrocervical trunk, which is a branch of the, are we medial enough? Probably, the subclavian artery. So the subclavian artery, thyrocervical trunk, transverse cervical artery, superficial cervical artery, dorsal scapular artery, and in fact maybe the deep parts of the trapezius muscle may receive branches from the posterior intercostal arteries. So I'm sure you'll agree with me that the trapezius muscle has got some pretty great anatomy. It's a really, really nice superficial muscle of the back. It's really important, has some great functions, blah, 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 blah. By the way, it also can be a cause of tension headaches because it's running up here to the occipital region back there through, you know, posture, like me sitting badly at a computer all day, stress, me worried about students passing their anatomy exams all year round, and that sort of thing. Or also entrapment of the accessory nerve, you know, increased tension, hypertension of this muscle up here can cause tension headaches. I just threw that one in for free. But there you go, the anatomy of the trapezius muscle, where it is, its origins and insertions, its actions, its major roles in day-to-day life and movements and that sort of thing, innervation and blood supply. Okay? It's quite a lot. See you next week.